He called it a fairy tale, a common girl elevated to royalty, chosen by a grieving king to be his new queen. The crowds cheered as she walked down the aisle, her borrowed dress a pale imitation among jewels and silks, her trembling hands hidden in the folds of fabric. No one saw the fear in her eyes. No one knew what was coming. The moment his lips touched hers at the altar, sealing their union before God and kingdom, he gripped her arm with bruising force. His whisper, meant for her ears alone, shattered every illusion. "My heart died with the mother of my daughters." In that single breath, as the crowd erupted in celebration, her sentence was delivered. A crown without love, a throne built on rejection, a marriage dead before it began. What happens when a woman with nothing becomes queen to a man who feels nothing? When the glittering palace is really a prison, and the only path forward requires strength no one believes she possesses. The kingdom is watching. The nobles are waiting for her to break, and the king's cold eyes hold secrets that could either destroy her or transform her into something no one ever expected. The smell of incense couldn't mask the contempt that hung in the air. Eleanor's trembling fingers clutched the folds of her borrowed dress, a pale imitation of finery amid the sea of silks and jewels that adorned the nobility. The great hall's massive oak doors had opened for her like the maw of some ancient beast, and with each step toward the stone altar, her heart slammed against her ribs in a desperate attempt to escape what was coming. Not from love, from terror. From the knowledge that she, a miller's daughter with dirt still embedded beneath her fingernails, was never meant to stand before a king. The whispers cut through the cathedral's reverent silence. A peasant bride. Political necessity. Disgraceful. Each word a small wound that stung more than the previous. Eleanor fixed her gaze on the altar ahead, refusing to meet the eyes that burned into her skin. Some filled with undisguised loathing, others with morbid curiosity, as though watching an execution rather than a wedding. Her dress, the finest she'd ever worn yet plainly inadequate among royal splendor, caught against the rough stone floor. The momentary stumble sent a ripple of suppressed laughter through the crowd. Eleanor's cheeks burned with humiliation as she righted herself, the cold sweat between her shoulder blades turning to ice. What cruel twist of fate had brought her here? The king needed to appease the restless peasantry after years of famine, and she, the outspoken daughter who had dared plead for her village, had become his political solution. A symbol, a sacrifice. The king waited at the altar, his face an unreadable mask of royal indifference. His beard, neatly trimmed and flecked with gray, framed a mouth that hadn't smiled since his beloved queen's death 3 winters past. Eleanor searched his eyes for some hint of humanity, some small kindness to cling to, but found only emptiness. The hollow eyes of a man who had agreed to this union with the same emotion he might order the slaughter of a pig for dinner. When she reached the altar, the weight of 1,000 stares pressed upon her shoulders. The cold stone beneath her knees sent shivers up her spine as she knelt. The ceremonial words washed over her in Latin waves she barely understood. Her mouth formed responses that her mind couldn't process. This wasn't marriage, it was surrender. The priest's hands shook slightly as he bound their hands with a silken cord. Eleanor couldn't help but notice how the king's fingers remained limp against hers, refusing even this small symbolic union. Behind him stood his 2 daughters, small, fragile things with their mother's eyes and their father's guarded expression. They watched with solemn curiosity, neither welcoming nor rejecting her presence. What would she be to them? A mother? A stranger? A usurper? "The kiss to seal your bond before God and kingdom," the priest announced, his voice echoing against stone walls that had witnessed centuries of royal marriages far more advantageous than this one. Time slowed to an excruciating crawl. The king leaned toward her, and a hushed anticipation fell over the assembly. Eleanor closed her eyes, steeling herself for this first physical contact with the man who was now her husband in name. His breath, warm, smelling faintly of wine, brushed against her face. The scent of leather and sweat and power enveloped her. His lips touched hers with mechanical precision, neither gentle nor rough, simply performing what was required. But then his hand suddenly gripped her upper arm with bruising force, fingers digging into her flesh. The kiss continued, a public display that seemed to satisfy the onlookers. but his mouth moved against her ear, and he whispered words meant only for her, each syllable sharp as a dagger. "My heart died with the mother of my daughters." The words pierced her more effectively than any blade. Eleanor's body went rigid, her lungs refusing to draw breath. The floor beneath her seemed to shift and tilt. In that moment, with his lips still against her skin in what appeared to be a tender gesture to all who watched, he had sentenced her to a lifetime of rejection. The nobles nearest to them must have seen something, a change in her expression perhaps, or the subtle cruelty in his grip, for their eyes widened in confusion or knowing amusement. A duchess behind the king raised an eyebrow, her painted lips curling into a smirk that said she knew exactly what had transpired. Trumpets blared, startling Eleanor back to the horrific present. The crowd erupted in applause, the commoners among them cheering for what they believed was a union that would bring their concerns to the throne. How little they knew. The bitter irony coated her tongue like metal. She who had been chosen to represent them had been publicly humiliated in the very moment that should have elevated her. The king withdrew from the kiss, his public duty fulfilled. His face betrayed nothing of the cruelty he had just inflicted. He turned to acknowledge his subjects, accepting their congratulations with practiced grace, while Eleanor stood frozen beside him. "Smile," he commanded through clenched teeth, his voice for her ears alone. "They expect their new queen to appear joyful." And so she smiled, swallowing tears that burned like fire in her throat. The bitter taste of humiliation spread through her mouth as she forced her lips to curve upward. Something hardened within her chest, not her heart, which throbbed with pain, but something deeper, more primal, a seed of survival, of defiance, planted in the fertile soil of betrayal. They processed down the aisle together, his hand resting atop hers in a performance of unity. The guests bowed as they passed, some sincere, others barely disguising their contempt. Eleanor caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Won't last the winter," just to silence the rabble. The queen would be turning in her grave. With each step toward the castle's great hall where the wedding feast awaited, Eleanor realized the true nature of her new reality. The altar that should have marked a beginning had instead become a gilded prison. There would be no fairy tale for someone like her, only cold bargains and power games played by rules she had yet to learn. And worse, the entire court was waiting, watching, to see how long she would last before breaking. Their calculating eyes followed her every movement, measuring her worth against impossible standards, eager to witness her inevitable failure. As they entered the banquet hall, servants scurrying to prepare for the feast, the king released her arm and immediately distanced himself, leaving her alone in a crowd of strangers who wished her gone. Eleanor touched her lips where his kiss had left its mark, feeling the phantom weight of his cruel words still pressing against her skin. The castle would be her home now, but home had never felt so dangerous. And somewhere in the stone labyrinth of corridors and chambers, two motherless girls awaited, ignorant of their father's whispered sentence against the woman who now bore the hollow title of their queen. The great hall roared with celebration that Eleanor could not feel. Laughter bounced off stone walls as nobles raised goblets in toasts that tasted of lies. The smell of roasted meat, fresh bread, and spiced wine filled the air, a feast fit for royalty that turned to ash in her mouth. Beneath the revelry, something darker slithered, whispers that reached her ears in fragments. The peasant queen. She'll never be one of us. How long before he sets her aside? Each word a small cut that stung more than the last. Eleanor sat rigid beside the king, her new husband, who spoke to everyone except her. The space between them on the dais, though only inches, stretched like an unbridgeable chasm. She felt the heat of his contempt without him sparing her a glance. The weight of the delicate crown, hastily fashioned for the occasion, pressed into her temples like thorns. It was lighter than it looked, a hollow thing, much like her title. "Did you know?" a lady-in-waiting whispered too loudly to another. "They say she bathed for the first time yesterday?" Titters spread like wildfire down the table. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her silver goblet, knuckles whitening. She knew the truth, that she had always been cleaner than most, even in her village. Her father had insisted on it. But the nobles needed their comforting lies to maintain the distance between themselves and those they deemed beneath them. A servant placed a plate before her, the arrangement of food more artistic than filling. Eleanor hesitated, suddenly aware that dozens of eyes watched for any mistake in etiquette. Which fork to use first? Should she wait for the king? The rules of the court were as foreign to her as the Latin prayers had been. She glanced sideways, furtively mimicking the movements of those around her. "You look lost," came a voice so cold it seemed to lower the temperature around them. The king hadn't turned his head, still facing the crowd as he addressed her for the first time since the altar. "Remember your place. You're here as a symbol, nothing more." Eleanor swallowed the bitter response that rose in her throat. "Yes, your majesty," she managed, the words scraping like sand. Across the table sat the king's daughters, two small figures draped in finery too heavy for their slender frames. The eldest, perhaps 10 years old, watched Eleanor with an intensity that felt like being dissected. The younger, no more than 6, kept her eyes downcast, occasionally stealing glances when she thought no one would notice. Both bore the unmistakable hollowness of motherless children, a look Eleanor recognized all too well from her own reflection after her mother's death years ago. The elder princess suddenly spoke, her voice carrying with unexpected authority for one so young. "Father, may I show the new queen the gardens tomorrow?" A hush fell over their section of the table. The king's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing beneath his skin. "Princess Matilda, the queen has much to learn about her duties. The gardens can wait." The way he said queen, like a curse, something distasteful, sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. Matilda's eyes darted between her father and Eleanor, a flash of rebellion quickly suppressed. "Of course, father." But beneath the table her small hand formed a fist. Eleanor felt a curious connection to this child who clearly harbored her own rebellions. Both of them trapped in roles they hadn't chosen, both regarded with suspicion by those who should have protected them. The realization settled in her chest like a stone. These children had lost their mother and gained nothing in return except a stranger who wore their mother's title like ill-fitting clothes. The younger princess, Rosalind, dropped her spoon with a clatter that echoed through the hall. Several heads turned and the child's face flushed crimson with embarrassment. Without thinking, Eleanor reached across, retrieving the spoon and replacing it with her own unused one. Their fingers brushed briefly, and the girl's wide eyes met hers in momentary surprise. "It happens to everyone," Eleanor whispered with a gentle smile. "Even queens." Something in the girl's face softened, a tiny crack in her carefully maintained composure. But the moment shattered as a nobleman further down the table called for attention, raising his goblet in another toast. "To our gracious king, who sacrifices for the good of the realm." The implied meaning hung heavy in the air, sacrificing by marrying so far beneath him. "May this union bring peace to our troubled lands." The court erupted in cheers, while peasant servants along the walls exchanged glances. Eleanor realized then the true nature of her position. To the nobles, she was a humiliation the king endured for political stability. To the common folk, she was supposed to be their voice, their representative in a world that had always excluded them. Both sides waited to see which way she would fall, which loyalty would claim her. The crown on her head might as well have been a noose. As the evening wore on, musicians played lively tunes that encouraged dancers to fill the center of the hall. The king participated in one perfunctory dance with his elder daughter, then disappeared into conversation with his advisors, pointedly excluding Eleanor from matters of state from her first hour as queen. A shadow fell across her plate. The royal chamberlain, Lord Bartley, loomed over her with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said, the honorific dripping with sarcasm, "allow me to explain some customs you'll be expected to uphold. The Queen's quarters are in the East Wing, far from the King's. You'll maintain separate households, of course. Previous queens held audiences on Wednesdays, but perhaps in your case, we should wait until you're—" He paused, his gaze sliding over her simple appearance. Properly prepared for court life. The humiliation burned like bile in her throat. Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Thank you for your concern, Lord Chamberlain. I look forward to learning quickly." Something in her tone made his smile falter briefly before he bowed. a fraction less deeply than protocol demanded, and withdrew. The feasting continued as night fell. Candles cast dancing shadows across stone walls covered with tapestries depicting royal hunts and victories. Eleanor felt the weight of eyes upon her, calculating, measuring, waiting for failure. The pressure built like a physical thing against her chest, making each breath an effort. "They'll never accept you," came a whisper from a passing lady, soft enough that only Eleanor could hear. The queen was beloved. You're just a peasant playing dress-up in her crown. In that moment, Eleanor understood with perfect clarity what she had become. Not a wife, not a queen, but a foreigner in her own land. She who had walked these very fields as a child, who knew the rhythm of the seasons and the language of the common folk, had become something alien and unwelcome within these walls. The irony tasted bitter. She belonged neither to the world she'd left nor the one she'd entered. As the feast finally waned, the king rose without announcement. Custom dictated that all stand when the monarch did, and Eleanor scrambled to her feet a moment too late, earning disapproving glances from the courtiers who moved with practiced precision. The wedding night, someone murmured nearby, followed by snickers. But the king merely looked through her as if she were glass. "You'll be shown to the queen's chambers," he said flatly. "I have matters to attend to." Without another word, he turned and left, taking with him any pretense that this marriage would ever be more than a political arrangement. Left alone on the dais, Eleanor felt the full weight of her new reality settle over her like a burial shroud. The crown that glittered in candlelight concealed the truth. It was a beautiful cage designed to crush its wearer. And as she followed a stern-faced lady-in-waiting through cold corridors to rooms that had belonged to a beloved dead woman, Eleanor understood that her battle had just begun. The doors to the queen's chambers opened to reveal a space both luxurious and haunted, everything preserved as if its former occupant might return at any moment. A portrait on the wall showed a beautiful woman with kind eyes that seemed to follow Eleanor accusingly, the same eyes the princesses had inherited. The air felt thick with memories she hadn't been part of, and expectations she could never fulfill. "The queen's things remain as she left them," the lady-in-waiting said stiffly. "His Majesty has not permitted anything to be moved." The message couldn't have been clearer. Eleanor might wear the title, but she would never truly replace the woman who had come before. As the door closed behind her, leaving her alone in a stranger's chambers, Eleanor finally allowed the tears she'd held back all day to fall. Not for the love she'd never have, but for the impossible path that stretched before her. Queen in name only, forever an outsider, trapped between worlds with no place to truly call home. Dawn broke with indifference to Eleanor's sleepless night. Pale light crept through leaded glass windows, illuminating the dead queen's chamber where Eleanor had tossed and turned among silk sheets that felt like shrouds. Her body ached from tension, eyes burning from unshed tears. The unfamiliar ceiling had become her confidant through dark hours filled with questions that had no answers. A sharp knock startled her from her haze. Before she could respond, 3 ladies-in-waiting entered, women whose names she hadn't yet learned, faces set in masks of dutiful contempt. They moved with practiced efficiency, dressing her in garments that, while finer than anything she'd owned, were notably simpler than those worn by noble-born ladies of the court. A message in fabric and thread: "You may be queen, but you remain common." "The Royal Council requests your presence," said the eldest of the women. Her voice clipped like winter branches. No explanation followed. Eleanor's stomach clenched. "The council? What do they want with me?" Her throat felt dry, the words emerging rough-edged and uncertain. The women exchanged glances, something unspoken passing between them. "It is not our place to say, Your Majesty," replied the woman, the title sounding like an insult on her tongue. Following her reluctant guides through corridors of cold stone, Eleanor felt the weight of centuries pressing down. Portraits of stern-faced nobles lined the walls, their painted eyes following her passage with ancestral disapproval. Servants scurried past with downcast eyes, though she caught whispers trailing in her wake. The morning air carried the scent of baking bread from the kitchens below, mingling strangely with the mustiness of ancient tapestries. "Do you know what awaits me?" Eleanor asked the youngest attendant, whose face had shown a flicker of something almost like pity earlier. The girl startled, eyes darting to her companions before answering. The council, they handle matters of state, land disputes, and... She fell silent at the sharp look from the elder lady. Land disputes. The words echoed in Eleanor's mind as they approached massive oak doors carved with the royal crest. Two guards stood at attention, their expressions carefully blank as they opened the way to the council chamber. The room struck her first with its chill, both physical and emotional. A massive table of polished wood dominated the center, around which sat 12 men in varying stages of middle and old age. Their silken doublets and heavy chains of office gleamed in the light from high windows. At the far end sat the king, his face as impassive as it had been at their wedding. Not one woman sat among them, except the chair clearly meant for her, positioned so that all eyes could bear down upon its occupant. Her Majesty, Queen Eleanor, announced a herald, the words falling flat in the charged atmosphere. Not a single man rose at her entrance. A deliberate slight. Eleanor forced her trembling legs to carry her forward, chin lifted despite the hammering of her heart. She took her seat with as much dignity as she could muster, the wooden chair cold beneath her. Lord Bartley, the chamberlain, spoke first. Your Majesty, we have brought you here on a matter requiring your signature. His voice carried the forced patience one might use with a particularly slow child. A simple formality, really. A document was placed before her. The parchment bore elaborate script, legal terminology that swam before her eyes. Eleanor blinked, forcing herself to focus on the words. Slowly their meaning penetrated her confusion. It was an order to reclaim lands that had been granted to peasant farmers during the previous year's famine. The same desperate farmers who had championed her cause, who had looked to her as their voice. The document would return those fields to noble families who had never worked a day with their hands, who had never known the desperation of a failed harvest. These lands, she said slowly, looking up, they belong to the people of Westbrook and Summerhill. They belong to the crown, corrected Lord Hadley, a thin man with a pinched face. They were temporarily allocated to address a crisis. That crisis has passed. Eleanor's fingers traced the parchment. The harvest hasn't even come in. How can you say the crisis has passed when people still hunger? A ripple of irritation passed through the council. One white-haired lord leaned forward. Those lands have belonged to noble families for generations. The temporary grant was an unfortunate necessity that must now be corrected. Her gaze drifted to the king, seeking some indication of his thoughts. But he remained a statue, observing the proceedings with detached interest. His silence spoke volumes. This was a test. She was being measured, evaluated. And if I choose not to sign? The question fell from her lips before she could reconsider. Smirks appeared on several faces. Lord Bartley's smile was particularly cold. Then, Your Majesty, you would be publicly refusing your first duty as queen, to support the realm's stability and traditional order. I'm certain the court would find such a stance noteworthy. The threat hung in the air. Eleanor understood the game now. Sign and betray the very people who had believed in her. Refuse and be branded unfit from her first day, giving the court ample reason to dismiss her as queen in all but name. The quill sat before her, its tip sharp as a dagger. Eleanor lifted it, feeling the weight of choice. She dipped it in the inkwell, the black liquid clinging to its point like poison. Her mind flashed to faces in her village. Weathered hands that had pressed gifts into hers when she left. Eyes that had shone with hope that one of their own would finally have the king's ear. Thomas the blacksmith, whose daughter had died in the famine. Old widow Marjorie, who had taught Eleanor to read from precious borrowed books. All looking to her now, though they couldn't see her in this cold chamber. The king's words from the altar whispered through her memory. My heart died with the mother of my daughters. He expected her to be nothing, a puppet, a symbol easily controlled and discarded. Perhaps that's exactly why he had chosen her. A woman of noble birth might have had allies, connections, power of her own. Eleanor looked up, meeting the eyes of the men who despised her. Something shifted inside her chest, a spark igniting where fear had reigned. Her hands stopped trembling. I understand completely, she said softly, lifting the parchment. She held it up as if to examine it one final time. Then, with a swift, deliberate motion that surprised even herself, Eleanor tore the document in two. The sound of ripping parchment echoed in the stunned silence, loud as thunder. She tore it again, the pieces fluttering from her fingers onto the polished table. "What have you done?" Lord Bartley's face flushed crimson, veins standing out on his forehead. Eleanor stood slowly, heart pounding so violently she was certain they must hear it. "I believe I've made my position clear, my lords." Her voice came from somewhere beyond her fear. "I will not begin my reign by taking food from the mouths of children." Outrage erupted around the table. Lords rose to their feet, voices clamoring over one another. "Unprecedented! The peasant shows her true colors. Your Majesty, control your wife." Through it all, the king remained seated, watching her with an expression that had shifted from indifference to something unreadable. Not approval, certainly not that, but perhaps a flicker of surprise, as though he'd expected a mouse and found a falcon. "You have no authority to refuse," Lord Hadley sputtered. "The council has already decided." "Then the council can find another way," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with each word that emerged. "One that doesn't punish those who can least afford it." She turned to leave, legs threatening to buckle beneath her, expecting at any moment to be seized by guards. The walk to the door stretched like an eternity, each step weighted with the enormity of what she'd done. No command came to stop her. As the heavy doors closed behind her, Eleanor leaned against the cold stone wall, her entire body shaking with delayed terror. What had she done? The recklessness of her action crashed over her like a wave. She had made enemies of the most powerful men in the kingdom within a day of becoming queen. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a whisper of strength she hadn't known she possessed. For the first time since entering the castle, she had acted as herself, not as the frightened girl playing at being queen. As she walked back through the corridors, Eleanor noticed servants watching her with new expressions, some fearful, others with carefully hidden admiration. Word traveled fast in castle walls. Her small act of defiance, foolish as it might prove, had transformed her from a curiosity into something more dangerous. By evening, the entire court would know. She would be labeled rebellious, ungrateful, unfit. But she would also be something else, a woman who could not be easily dismissed or controlled. The nobles had expected a doll to dress in royal clothes. Instead, they had found steel beneath silk. Eleanor returned to her chambers, closed the door, and finally allowed herself to breathe. The battle lines had been drawn. She had declared, with that single torn document, that she would not be merely a piece to be moved across their political board. Whether this choice would lead to her downfall or her salvation remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the silent war had begun. The consequences of defiance settled over Eleanor like winter frost, gradual, relentless, and bitterly cold. 3 days had passed since she'd torn the document in the council chamber, and the castle had transformed around her. Servants who had once merely avoided her eyes now actively neglected her requests, leaving her chambers unattended until well past midday. Her meals arrived cold, wine cups unfilled, bathwater barely lukewarm. Not outright refusal, nothing so obvious that she could name the offense, but 1,000 small negligences designed to make her feel powerless. In the great hall, her chair remained conspicuously empty during council meetings. The message was clear. She had rejected their authority, so they would erase her presence. Eleanor found herself wandering the stone corridors like a ghost, her footsteps echoing in spaces that emptied mysteriously at her approach. Ladies-in-waiting assigned to her service found endless excuses to be elsewhere, their absence punctuated by distant laughter that cut off abruptly whenever she rounded a corner. The isolation pressed against her chest like a physical weight. Eleanor stood at her chamber window, watching rain streak the leaded glass, distorting the view of the muddy courtyard below. A servant girl crossed the open space, hood pulled against the downpour, and glanced up at the window. Their eyes met briefly before the girl hurriedly looked away, quickening her pace. Even the lowest servants felt entitled to show contempt to the peasant queen who had dared overstep. "You asked for fresh candles, Your Majesty." The voice from the doorway was clipped, formal. Lady Agnes, the eldest of her assigned attendants, carried a single taper rather than the half-dozen Eleanor had requested. The woman's gray eyes held thinly veiled satisfaction as she placed it on the table. The steward regrets that supplies are limited. A lie so transparent it barely deserved the name. Eleanor had seen servants delivering armfuls of beeswax candles to other chambers that very morning. "Thank you, Lady Agnes," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice steady. She would not give them the satisfaction of complaint. "That will be all." The woman curtsied with precise, minimal movement, just low enough to avoid outright disrespect, but shallow enough to convey disdain, and withdrew. Eleanor pressed her fingers against the cold stone of the window casement, feeling the rough texture ground her in reality. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to release them. Crying would change nothing. She had made her choice in that council chamber, chosen dignity over compliance, and now she would bear the cost. The king himself had become a shadow, glimpsed only at formal meals where he sat at the far end of the high table, speaking to his advisors as if she did not exist. His indifference was more cutting than any anger could have been. At least rage would have acknowledged her as something worth noticing. Eleanor moved to her writing desk, a beautiful piece of oak that had belonged to the previous queen. Like everything else in these chambers, it felt borrowed, temporary. She ran her fingers along the polished surface, lingering over a small carved rose in the corner. So delicate, yet permanently etched into the wood. Something that would outlast all of them. As her hand passed over the drawer, she noticed it was slightly ajar. Frowning, Eleanor pulled it open. She had kept nothing of value there, having brought few possessions to the castle. But nestled in the otherwise empty drawer lay a single white flower, a lily, fresh and fragrant, its petals still bearing droplets of dew. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She lifted the bloom carefully, turning it in her fingers. It had been placed there deliberately, recently, a gesture that could not be anything but intentional. But who would risk showing her kindness when the entire court had aligned against her? A memory flickered, Princess Matilda at the wedding feast, asking to show Eleanor the gardens. The eldest daughter, watching her with those solemn, assessing eyes. Could it be? The thought sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. If the child had indeed left this token, discovery could mean punishment. The king might view any alliance between his daughter and his unwanted queen as betrayal. Eleanor quickly returned the flower to the drawer, sliding it closed. This small act of compassion was like a candle flame in darkness, precious and fragile, needing protection. The realization that she might not be entirely alone in this cold place warmed something within her that had begun to freeze. But it also brought new fear. She would not risk harm coming to a child who had shown her kindness. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts, followed immediately by the door opening without waiting for her response. Lord Bartley entered, flanked by two guards whose hands rested meaningfully on their sword hilts. "Your Majesty," he said, the honorific dripping with contempt. "I bring word from the King's Council." Eleanor straightened, lifting her chin slightly. "Lord Chamberlain, I was unaware that the council now enters a queen's private chambers without permission." His nostrils flared briefly, the only sign that her words had struck a nerve. "The council wishes to inform you that your display has been noted. While the king has chosen not to publicly censure his new bride, certain adjustments have been made to reflect your apparent disinterest in supporting the realm's governance." "Adjustments?" Eleanor kept her voice even. "Your household allowance has been reduced. After all, one with such concern for the common folk surely needs little luxury." His thin lips curved into what might charitably be called a smile. "Additionally, your presence will not be required at council meetings until you have demonstrated a more amenable attitude. Isolation and impoverishment, punishment designed to break her will without creating public scandal." Eleanor felt her nails dig into her palms as she fought to maintain composure. "Is there anything else, Lord Chamberlain?" His eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps disappointed by her restraint. "Only that several nobles have expressed concern about your influence on the royal princesses. It has been decided that your contact with them will be limited to formal occasions, under supervision." The blow landed as intended. Eleanor couldn't prevent the small intake of breath that betrayed her shock. They would deny her even the possibility of connection with the children, the only ones who had shown her anything but contempt. "The king agreed to this?" she asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Lord Bartley's smile deepened. "His Majesty is concerned primarily with his daughter's welfare. I'm sure you understand." After he departed, Eleanor sank into the window seat, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the rain had transformed into a proper storm, lightning occasionally illuminating the courtyard in harsh white flashes. The weather matched the turbulence within her, anger and despair battling for supremacy. They had calculated well, these men who had spent lifetimes playing power games. They had identified her vulnerabilities and struck precisely. Isolation from potential allies, restriction from the children who might have offered connection, removal from any position where her voice might be heard. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Eleanor became aware of something unexpected. Whispers from the servants' quarters, fragments of conversations that ceased when she approached but left traces behind like smoke. "Stood against the council," she had overheard one kitchen maid say. "Refused to take the farmer's land," another had whispered. "Queen of the people," a stable boy had murmured before being hushed by his companion. The realization dawned slowly. While the nobility had closed ranks against her, something different was happening among the castle's commoners. The story of her defiance had spread, transformed, taken root in unexpected places. In the villages beyond the castle walls, among the very people whose lands she had defended, her name was being spoken with something new. Respect, perhaps even hope. Eleanor's hands stopped trembling as this knowledge settled within her. She was playing a game whose rules she barely understood, on a board designed to ensure her failure. But perhaps the pieces were not arranged quite as her opponents believed. The nobles might control the castle, but the kingdom extended far beyond these walls. As twilight deepened outside her window, Eleanor caught sight of a servant crossing the courtyard, head bent against the rain. The woman paused, glancing up at Eleanor's window, and made a small, almost imperceptible gesture. A hand pressed briefly to her heart before hurrying onward. A sign of solidarity, so small it could be denied if questioned, yet unmistakable in its intent. Eleanor drew back from the window, mind racing. The nobles had their power, their titles, their centuries of entrenched authority. But they had made a critical error. They had forgotten that she understood the common folk in ways they never could. They saw her peasant origins as weakness. Perhaps instead, they might prove to be her strength. She moved to the desk and carefully opened the drawer, looking once more at the lily hidden within. The flower was both gift and warning, beauty and danger intertwined, just like the position she now occupied. The castle might be a battlefield where every step could lead to disaster, but she was beginning to see paths forward where before there had been only walls. Eleanor closed the drawer gently, protecting her small secret. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new humiliations designed to break her will. But tonight, something had changed. The knowledge that she was not fighting alone, that unseen eyes watched and judged and perhaps even hoped, kindled a spark that even the cold stone of the castle could not extinguish. A fortnight into her reign, Eleanor began to notice the fracturing of the court around her. What had once been unified contempt now splintered into something more dangerous: uncertainty. She felt it in the sidelong glances as she walked the corridors, the way conversations shifted when she approached. The nobles no longer simply dismissed her. They watched her, evaluated her, as one might study an unfamiliar creature that had unexpectedly shown teeth. Lord Bartley's inner circle had grown more venomous. Eleanor overheard fragments as she passed an alcove. "Witch, enchantress, bewitched the king," followed by muffled laughter. The absurdity of it might have made her laugh, if not for the malice behind it. How could anyone believe she had enchanted a man who could barely stand to look at her? Yet the whispers spread like poison through honeyed wine, designed to isolate her further. "They say she makes potions by moonlight," a lady-in-waiting murmured to another as Eleanor entered the solar, their voices deliberately audible. How else would a peasant rise so far? Eleanor felt their eyes on her back as she crossed to the window, her throat tight with unspoken retorts. They knew as well as she that her marriage had been a political calculation, nothing more. But lies served their purpose, painting her as something unnatural, something to be feared and eliminated. Not all reactions followed this pattern, however. Eleanor had begun to identify another faction, quieter, more cautious nobles who studied her with calculation rather than malice. Baron Thornfield, an elderly man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, had nodded to her yesterday, a gesture so small it might have been imagined, yet deliberate in its acknowledgement. Lady Rowena, whose family controlled the eastern grain stores, had asked her opinion on the spring planting during a chance encounter. Small moments, easily dismissed, yet Eleanor catalogued each one carefully. Not allies, not yet, but perhaps those willing to wait and watch, to see what this unexpected queen might become. She walked the castle ramparts alone, wrapped in a wool cloak against the spring chill. Below, in the inner bailey, knights trained in formation, the clash of practiced swords carrying up to her on the wind. Servants hurried across the cobblestones, carrying baskets and pushing carts. The castle breathed around her, a living organism with its own rhythms and secrets. Eleanor moved carefully along the narrow walkway, painfully aware that one misstep, literal or figurative, could mean destruction. The stones beneath her feet were slick with morning dew, treacherous in their beauty. Much like her position, glittering with apparent privilege yet perilous with every step. "Your Majesty." The small voice startled her, nearly causing the very stumble she feared. Princess Rosalind stood in the shadow of a tower doorway, her slight frame almost swallowed by the heavy wooden door. The king's younger daughter, not yet 7 years old, watched Eleanor with solemn eyes that had seen too much sorrow for one so young. Eleanor glanced around quickly, ensuring no witnesses. "Princess, should you not be with your tutors?" She kept her voice gentle despite the warning bells ringing in her mind. Lord Bartley had made the consequences of unsupervised contact with the royal children painfully clear. "I finished my lessons early." The girl stepped forward, thin fingers clutching something tight against her chest. "And I wanted to give you this." She extended her hand, revealing a small carved wooden figure, a bird with outstretched wings. Eleanor's throat constricted. She knelt slowly, bringing herself to the child's level. "It's beautiful. Father gave it to me before—" The princess didn't finish, but she didn't need to, before the queen died, before everything changed. "But I think you should have it now. Birds should be free, don't you think?" The layers of meaning in the child's words struck Eleanor like physical blows. This wasn't merely a gift. It was a message, delivered with a wisdom beyond the girl's years, and a risk that made Eleanor's heart stutter with fear for the child. "Princess, this is too precious. I cannot. Please." Rosalind pressed the carving into Eleanor's palm, small fingers surprisingly strong. "Matilda says you're different from the others, that you're brave." Eleanor closed her hand around the wooden bird, the smooth grain warm against her skin. "Your sister said that?" The princess nodded, glancing over her shoulder as footsteps echoed somewhere below. "I must go. They'll be looking for me." She hesitated, then added in a whisper, "The servants talk about you. They say you stand up to Lord Bartley. They say you care about the people outside the castle." Before Eleanor could respond, the girl darted away, disappearing through the tower door like a wraith. Eleanor remained kneeling, the carved bird clutched in her hand, its wings pressing into her palm. The encounter left her shaken in ways the nobles' direct attacks never had. This fragile child, reaching out despite the risks, had shown more courage than many grown men. And her words revealed something Eleanor had only begun to suspect. Her actions in the council chamber had ripples extending beyond the castle walls. That evening, as she dined alone in her chambers, another calculated slight, Eleanor overheard 2 servants speaking in the corridor outside her door. "My cousin says they're talking about her in the village," one whispered, "calling her the people's queen, they are." "Dangerous talk," the other replied. "But they say she tore up Lord Hadley's eviction notices right in front of the council. Takes courage, that does. Or foolishness. Maybe both." Their footsteps faded, but their words remained, settling into Eleanor like stones in a pond. The story had grown, transformed in the telling. What had been a simple refusal was becoming something legendary in the retelling. A dangerous development, for her certainly, but perhaps for others as well. Later that night, a knock on her chamber door revealed a serving girl, eyes downcast, bearing fresh linens. As she laid them on the bed, the girl whispered so softly Eleanor almost missed it. "The eastern villages pray for you, Your Majesty." Before Eleanor could respond, the girl was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of lavender from the linens and words that hung in the air like smoke. Sleep eluded her that night. Eleanor paced her chambers, the wooden bird clutched in her hand, turning these developments over in her mind. The common folk were watching her, investing hope in her, a burden as heavy as it was unexpected. Their expectations could crush her as surely as the nobles' contempt. Dawn found her still awake, standing at her window as the castle stirred to life below. A sharp knock heralded Lady Agnes, entering with uncharacteristic haste. "The king requests your presence in the royal solar." Immediately. Something in the woman's tone sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. The royal solar occupied the highest level of the king's tower, a room Eleanor had heard described but never seen. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting colored patterns across a floor scattered with rush matting and sweet herbs. The king stood with his back to her, gazing out over his lands, shoulders rigid beneath rich velvet. "Leave us," he commanded without turning. Lady Agnes withdrew with obvious reluctance, the door closing with ominous finality. Eleanor stood silent, heart hammering against her ribs. This was their first private audience since the wedding night. Whatever had prompted it could not bode well. "My advisors tell me interesting tales," the king said finally, still facing the window. "They say my new queen has become a symbol to the common folk. That stories of your defiance travel from village to village." Eleanor's mouth went dry. "I cannot control what people say, Your Majesty." "Can you not?" He turned then, fixing her with eyes cold as midwinter. "Strange that a woman with no power, no allies, no position beyond what I granted her, should suddenly become the subject of such widespread discussion." "I have taken no action to encourage such talk," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "And yet it spreads." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the clove and cinnamon on his breath. "What game do you play, Eleanor of Westbrook? Did you think to use my own people against me?" The accusation hung between them, sharp as a drawn blade. Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her, the precarious position she occupied growing more treacherous by the moment. "I play no game, Your Majesty. I seek only to fulfill my duty as best I understand it." "Your duty," he echoed, the words flat and cold. "Your duty was to be a symbol, nothing more. A convenient fiction to appease restless peasants, not to become their champion." Something in his tone, the dismissive certainty that she existed merely as a tool for his purposes, kindled a spark of anger that overrode Eleanor's caution. "Then perhaps you should have made that clearer before placing a crown upon my head." The king's eyes widened fractionally, surprise momentarily displacing anger. Few dared speak to him with such directness. The moment stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Eleanor waited for the explosion, the punishment that must surely follow such boldness. Instead, the king turned away once more, his voice deceptively calm. "I notice my daughters seek your company. Rosalind asked for you yesterday." The abrupt change of subject disoriented Eleanor, until she recognized the veiled threat beneath. The children, her one fragile connection in this hostile place. "The princesses have been kind to me," she said carefully. "They lost their mother." His knuckles whitened on the windowsill. "They are vulnerable to those who might exploit their need for female companionship." The implication struck like a physical blow. "I would never use children so. Perhaps not intentionally." He faced her again, something unreadable in his expression. "But they will be removed from court if necessary. Sent to foster with trusted allies where they cannot become pawns in whatever strategy you devise." The threat, delivered with such calm deliberation, chilled Eleanor more than any display of rage could have. He had identified her growing attachment to the children and moved immediately to weaponize it against her. "I understand, Your Majesty." The words tasted like ash. Do you? He studied her with cold assessment. I wonder. The game of courts is not played with honorable intentions or direct confrontation, Eleanor. It is played with whispers and allegiances, with patience and calculation. You have survived longer than many expected, but do not mistake survival for victory. As she left the solar, Eleanor felt the full weight of realization settle over her. This wasn't merely about acceptance or endurance. The quiet war that had begun in the council chamber had escalated beyond her control. Her very existence had become a challenge to established power, and those who held that power would not relinquish it without a fight that would consume everything and everyone in its path. The great hall blazed with torchlight, its stone walls draped with crimson and gold banners for the spring feast. Nobles in their finest garments preened and postured like peacocks, jewels winking in the flickering light. Eleanor sat at the high table, the empty chair between her and the king a physical manifestation of their estrangement. The crown on her head, lighter than the one she'd worn at her wedding, yet somehow heavier with each passing day, pressed against her temples like a band of ice. She had spent hours preparing for this public appearance, knowing every eye would search for weakness, every ear strain for missteps. Her gown, midnight blue and simple compared to the ornate fashions around her, had been carefully chosen to project dignity without ostentation. She would not give them the satisfaction of appearing to reach beyond her station, nor would she shrink into invisibility as they clearly desired. The feast marked the vernal equinox, traditionally a time of renewal and hope. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, Eleanor sensed currents of tension like undertows beneath a calm sea. Lord Bartley and his allies clustered at one end of the hall, heads bent in furtive conversation, occasionally casting glances in her direction. Other nobles watched this byplay with wary calculation, sensing the shifting of alliances but unwilling to commit themselves. Eleanor sipped her wine sparingly, kneading her wits sharp. The servants who attended her moved with stiff formality, their reluctance to approach evident in averted eyes and hesitant hands. Only one, a girl barely into womanhood with auburn hair escaping her cap, offered a fleeting smile when refilling Eleanor's goblet, the briefest acknowledgement of shared humanity in a room determined to deny it. The king ate methodically, engaging in conversation with dignitaries while maintaining the careful fiction that the woman beside him did not exist. His profile, sharp in the torchlight, revealed nothing of his thoughts. Eleanor had seen him only twice since their confrontation in the solar, each encounter marked by icy formality that left her more unnerved than outright hostility might have. Across the table, the princesses sat with their governess. Matilda, the elder at 10 years old, maintained the composed dignity expected of her position, though her eyes occasionally strayed to Eleanor with unguarded curiosity. Little Rosalind beside her seemed unusually subdued, picking at her food with none of a child's typical restlessness. The wooden bird she had gifted Eleanor weighed heavy in the pocket sewn into Eleanor's gown, a tangible reminder of unexpected connections in this hostile place. As the main course concluded, minstrels began a lilting tune that filled the hall. Conversation swelled around Eleanor like rising water, threatening to drown her in forced isolation even in this crowded space. She focused on maintaining her expression, neither too somber, which would be criticized as ungrateful, nor too pleased, which would be condemned as presumptuous. The narrow path allowed her had grown more constricted with each passing day. A servant placed a slice of honeyed cake before her just as Lord Bartley rose from his seat, goblet in hand. The hall quieted, attention turning to the chamberlain whose influence rivaled all but the king himself. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vast space, "we celebrate today not only the turning of seasons, but the continued prosperity of our realm under the wise governance of our beloved king." Murmurs of approval rippled through the assembly. Eleanor kept her expression neutral, though her grip tightened imperceptibly on her knife. "In these uncertain times," Lord Bartley continued, his gaze sweeping the hall before settling, with deliberate intent, upon Eleanor, "we must remain vigilant against those who would undermine the natural order of our kingdom, those who would place common interests above noble birthright." The hall grew quieter still, the minstrel's music fading to silence. Eleanor felt the weight of countless stares pressing against her skin. "We have heard disturbing reports," Lord Bartley said, voice lowered as if sharing confidences with hundreds of commoners speaking of rebellion, emboldened by certain recent developments. The implication hung in the air, unmistakable to all present. Eleanor held herself perfectly still, even as her heart thundered in her chest. This was no impromptu speech, but a calculated attack, designed to isolate and implicate her before the entire court. To her right, the king set down his goblet with a sharp sound that cracked through the tension like lightning. All eyes shifted to him as he rose from his seat, towering over the assembly. "Lord Chamberlain speaks of rumors I too have heard," the king said, his voice cold and precise. "Rumors of unrest fomented by those who should know their proper place." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had expected many things, but not this direct public assault. Beneath the table, her nails dug crescents into her palms. The king turned toward her, his gaze falling upon her for the first time that evening. "It seems my queen has developed sympathies that conflict with the interests of the crown." The accusation struck like a physical blow. Eleanor felt blood drain from her face, leaving her lightheaded with shock. The room seemed to tilt around her, hundreds of faces blurring into a sea of judgment and condemnation. This was execution by another name. Social death before the witnesses who mattered most in this world of power and privilege. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice barely audible even to herself. "I have never—" "She helps us when no one else will." The small, clear voice sliced through the tension like a blade. Princess Matilda stood beside her chair, her slight frame rigid with determination, chin lifted in unconscious mimicry of her father's authority. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the crackling of the great fire seemed muted by collective shock. "Princess," the governess whispered urgently, reaching for the child's arm, but Matilda stepped away. "The queen reads to us," the princess continued, her voice gathering strength. "She teaches Rosalind to braid her hair as mother did. She listens when we speak." Her gaze swept the assembly with surprising authority for one so young. "No one else has shown us such kindness since mother died." Eleanor couldn't breathe. The child's defense, as unexpected as it was dangerous, had transformed a moment of calculated humiliation into something far more complicated. The risk the princess had taken, challenging not only Lord Bartley but her father himself, was beyond measure. Lord Bartley recovered first. "Princess Matilda speaks with a child's innocent affection," he said smoothly, though a muscle twitched beside his eye. "Yet matters of state require mature understanding. Is it a matter of state for my daughters to receive kindness?" The king's voice cut through Bartley's recovery like a sword through silk. His expression remained unreadable, but something had shifted in his stance, a tension that hadn't been there before. The assembled nobles held collective breath, caught in the unexpected current of a drama none had anticipated. Eleanor felt suspended between heartbeats, unable to predict which way this precarious moment would fall. "My lord," Lord Bartley began again, uncertainty bleeding into his tone. "The princess speaks plainly, as children often do." The king's gaze never left his daughter, whose small shoulders remained squared despite the weight of attention upon her. Perhaps we would benefit from such clarity more often. Matilda's expression softened fractionally, hope flickering across her features before royal training reasserted control. The king returned to his seat with deliberate calm, reaching for his goblet as if the extraordinary exchange had been nothing of consequence. "Continue the festivities," he commanded, and the musicians hastily resumed their interrupted melody. Conversation tentatively rekindled throughout the hall, though with a different quality than before, hushed, speculative, reassessing alliances and assumptions in light of what had just transpired. Lord Bartley returned to his seat, his earlier confidence visibly diminished. Eleanor remained motionless, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever fragile protection had unexpectedly manifested around her. Only when she dared a glance at the king did she find him watching her, his gaze no longer indifferent but evaluating, seeing her, perhaps for the first time, as something more complex than the convenient political symbol he had expected. There was no warmth in his scrutiny, no softening of judgment, but rather the focused assessment of a strategist recognizing an unexpected element on the battlefield. The revelation shuddered through the court like an earthquake, imperceptible to outsiders perhaps, but recognized by all who lived within its delicate ecosystem of power. The queen, meant to be invisible and inconsequential, had somehow secured the loyalty of the royal princesses. The children, previously pawns in the game of court politics, had revealed themselves as potential players with wills of their own. As the feast progressed with surface normality, Eleanor felt the subtle shift in the current of glances directed her way. No longer simple contempt, but something more complex. Wariness, reassessment, calculation. Noble ladies who had previously snubbed her now studied her with concealed interest, wondering if previous assumptions required revision. Lords who had dismissed her as inconsequential now measured her with new caution. The king spoke not another word to her that evening, but twice more she caught him watching her with that same inscrutable intensity, as if trying to discern something essential about her character that had eluded him until now. Each time Eleanor met his gaze steadily, refusing to show the fear and uncertainty that churned beneath her carefully maintained composure. When at last the feast concluded, Eleanor rose to withdraw to her chambers. As she passed Matilda's chair, the princess slipped something into her hand, a folded scrap of parchment, passed so discreetly that even the watchful governess failed to notice. Eleanor closed her fingers around it, continuing without breaking stride. Only within the sanctuary of her chambers, door firmly barred against intrusion, did Eleanor unfold the princess's message. Written in a child's careful hand were 6 words that changed everything. They cannot make us stop loving. Eleanor pressed the parchment to her chest, overwhelmed by emotions too complex to name. The princess had done more than defend her. She had declared allegiance in the most fundamental terms possible. And in doing so, she had transformed Eleanor's position in ways that neither Eleanor nor her enemies could have anticipated. The court that had dismissed her as a peasant playing at royalty now faced an uncomfortable truth. The queen they had tried to isolate had become bound to the royal line through ties that transcended politics. Not through the king's affection, which remained as distant as ever, but through the unexpected loyalty of his children, the future of the realm itself. Eleanor placed the princess's note beside the wooden bird, these talismans of connection in a world designed to keep her forever separate. The game had changed tonight. The path ahead remained treacherous, perhaps even more so than before, but for the first time since entering the castle, Eleanor felt something unexpected unfurling within her chest. Not hope, she was still too practical for that, but possibility. And for tonight, that was enough. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a stone-faced guard rather than the usual lady-in-waiting. The council chamber, immediately. No time for proper dress or preparation. Eleanor felt dread pool in her stomach as she hastily fastened a simple gown, the urgency of the command leaving no doubt that something momentous had occurred. The corridors were unusually active for such an early hour. Servants scurried with downcast eyes, nobles huddled in whispered conference, breaking apart at her approach. The air itself seemed charged with tension, pressing against her skin like the heaviness before a storm. Eleanor quickened her pace, heart hammering against her ribs. The great oak doors of the council chamber stood open, an oddity that heightened her unease. Within, the scene struck her instantly as wrong. The king's advisors were arranged not in their usual orderly formation, but in fragmented clusters, some standing, others seated, their faces flushed with what appeared to be recent argument. Lord Bartley stood closest to the king, leaning toward the monarch with uncharacteristic urgency. The king himself sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles white where they gripped the carved armrests. All conversation ceased as Eleanor crossed the threshold, dozens of eyes swiveling toward her with expressions ranging from calculated neutrality to undisguised hostility. "Her Majesty the Queen," announced the herald, his voice oddly flat. No one bowed. The breach of protocol hung in the air like a drawn blade. "Approach," the king commanded, his voice betraying nothing of his thoughts. Eleanor moved forward on legs that threatened to betray her, conscious of the whispers that trailed in her wake. The absence of a chair for her, another deliberate slight, forced her to stand before them all like a supplicant, or, worse, a defendant. Lord Bartley stepped forward, a parchment clutched in his hand. "Your Majesty," he addressed the king, pointedly ignoring Eleanor's presence. "As I was explaining before this interruption, the evidence is incontrovertible. Lord Hawthorne's confession, extracted before his unfortunate demise, names every conspirator involved in the plot." "What plot?" The words escaped Eleanor before she could contain them, earning a withering glance from the chamberlain. "A conspiracy," Lord Bartley continued, addressing the assembled council rather than answering her directly, "to undermine His Majesty's authority and eventually remove him from the throne. A conspiracy that uses His Majesty's unconventional choice of queen as its central justification." The blood drained from Eleanor's face as understanding dawned. This was no mere court intrigue, but an accusation of treason, with her at its center. "The conspirators claim," Lord Bartley continued, his voice carrying with practiced precision, "that by marrying a commoner, His Majesty has degraded the crown. They argue that such a union disrespects the memory of our beloved late queen and signals a dangerous disregard for noble bloodlines that have preserved our kingdom for generations." Eleanor's gaze darted to the king, searching for some indication of his thoughts. His face remained impassive, carved from stone, giving nothing away. Furthermore, the chamberlain pressed on, "They suggest that the queen's growing popularity among the peasantry represents a deliberate strategy to shift power away from its rightful wielders." His eyes fixed on Eleanor with cold accusation. "To create division between the crown and the nobility that has faithfully served it." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Eleanor felt the weight of judgment pressing down upon her, the careful isolation engineered over weeks now crystallizing into something far more dangerous. "I have never," she began, only to be cut off by Lord Bartley's raised hand. "The question before this council is not Your Majesty's guilt or innocence," he said with exaggerated patience, "but rather what action must be taken to quell this threat before it spreads further." An elderly lord with a face like crumpled parchment spoke from his seat near the window. "The conspiring nobles must be arrested immediately, of course. Their lands forfeit to the crown." "Indeed," agreed Lord Bartley. "But that addresses only the symptom, not the disease." His gaze slid meaningfully toward Eleanor. "To truly end this threat, we must remove the justification they claim. His Majesty must publicly repudiate this unfortunate union." The words hung in the air like poison. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, the floor seeming to tilt beneath her feet. This had been their aim all along, to engineer a situation where the king would have no choice but to cast her aside. "The people have grown attached to their peasant queen," another advisor cautioned. "Such an action could spark the very unrest we seek to prevent." "Better small protests now than revolution later," countered Lord Bartley. "A clean break, a clear message that His Majesty recognizes his error in judgment and corrects it for the good of the realm." Eleanor stood frozen as they discussed her fate, as if she were not present, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person whose life hung in the balance. The familiar humiliation of invisibility washed over her, followed by something new, a surge of anger so powerful it burned away her fear. "Your Majesty." Her voice cut through the debate like a blade, stronger than she had intended. "May I address the council?" Silence fell, heavy with shock at her audacity. Lord Bartley's face darkened with fury at the interruption. The king studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with the slightest inclination of his head, he granted permission. Eleanor stepped forward, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her voice remained steady as she faced the men who had conspired to destroy her from the moment of her arrival. "My lords," she began, "you speak of loyalty to the crown while plotting its diminishment. You claim devotion to tradition while disregarding the oldest tradition of all, the sacred bond between ruler and subject." Lord Bartley made to interrupt, but the king raised a hand, silencing him. "I have heard you discuss me as a symbol," Eleanor continued, her voice gathering strength. "A political tool, a convenient scapegoat, a mistake to be erased. Yet you overlook what I truly represent, The people whose labor sustains your privilege, whose hands build your castles, whose children die in your wars. She turned slowly, meeting the gaze of each council member in turn. You fear me not because I threaten the king, but because I remind you of those you would prefer to forget. The farmers whose lands you seize without thought, the villagers who starve while your storehouses overflow. Eleanor felt something strange happening within the chamber, a shift in the quality of attention fixed upon her. No longer simply hostility, but a reluctant recognition. You speak of conspiracy, she continued, turning to Lord Bartley directly. Yet, who has more conspired against the crown's true interests? Those who suggest the king might care for all his subjects, or those who daily counsel him to dismiss the suffering of the many for the comfort of the few? Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them fiercely away. This was no moment for weakness. I did not ask to be queen. I did not seek this crown or the scrutiny that comes with it. But having been placed in this position, I will not, pretend that the people beyond these walls do not matter. Her gaze found the king's, holding it with unexpected steadiness. Your Majesty married me for political expedience, to quell unrest among the common folk who felt forgotten by their king. If you now repudiate that union, you do not solve your problem. You confirm their deepest fears, that their lives, their concerns, their very existence is disposable when inconvenient to those in power. The silence that followed her words was profound, not the hostile quiet of before, but something weighted with uncomfortable truth. Eleanor stood before them, no longer trembling, her back straight as she awaited judgment. The king rose from his seat, his height imposing as he towered over the assembly. All eyes shifted to him, anticipation hanging in the air like smoke. My lords, he said, his voice carrying the authority of one born to command, we face a choice that will echo through generations, not simply a matter of one marriage, but a question of what kind of monarchy we shall be. He stepped down from the dais, moving with deliberate slowness until he stood directly before Eleanor. She held her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to retreat from the inscrutable intensity of his gaze. I have heard many voices counsel me on matters of state, the king continued, addressing the room though his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor. I have listened to arguments of tradition and warnings of change, yet I find myself asking, what strength is there in a crown so fragile that it cannot bend without breaking? What power in a throne so weak that it fears the voices of its own people? A murmur rippled through the council, confusion mingling with disbelief. The conspirators will be dealt with, the king declared, turning to face his advisors. Their treachery will meet appropriate justice, but I will not repudiate my queen. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This was not the outcome any had anticipated, least of all herself. Your Majesty, Lord Bartley protested, his voice strained with barely contained outrage. Consider what you risk. I consider what I gain, the king interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. A monarchy that rules through respect rather than fear. A court reminded that its purpose is not self-preservation, but service to the realm. All of the realm. His gaze returned to Eleanor, something undefined stirring beneath the surface of his customary reserve. Not warmth, not yet, but perhaps the first recognition of her as something more than a political necessity. The council is dismissed, he commanded. I will speak with my queen alone. The assembled nobles withdrew with reluctance, Lord Bartley's face contorted with poorly concealed fury as he bowed and backed away. The heavy doors closed behind them, leaving Eleanor alone with the king for the first time since their confrontation in the solar. Why? The question escaped her before she could contain it, hanging in the air between them. The king moved to the window, gazing out over the kingdom spread below. They expected me to cast you aside at the first sign of difficulty, he said after a long pause, to confirm what they have always believed, that kings rule by divine right, unchallenged by conscience or consequence. He turned to face her, his expression grave. I have ruled that way since Sophia died, perhaps even before. It is a cold comfort, such certainty. Eleanor remained silent, afraid to shatter this unexpected moment of candor. You spoke truths today that no one else in this castle would dare voice, he continued. Not from ambition or calculation, but from conviction. A shadow of something almost like respect crossed his features. I had forgotten how rare that quality is within these walls. "This changes nothing between us," Eleanor said softly, needing to name the reality that still existed beneath this momentary alliance. "No," he agreed, the word falling between them like stone. "My heart remains where I told you it would on our wedding day. But perhaps we may yet find a different path forward, one that serves the kingdom, if not ourselves." As Eleanor left the chamber, she felt the tremors of what had transpired spreading through her like ripples in still water. Not victory, nothing so simple or complete, but a recognition, however reluctant, that could not be withdrawn. She had spoken with the voice that had been denied her since her arrival, and for one crucial moment, she had been heard. The battle lines had shifted today in ways no one could have predicted, and in their shifting had revealed possibilities none had dared imagine. Least of all the peasant girl who had walked into a castle expecting only humiliation, and instead found, against all odds, the first fragile seedling of power. Morning light spilled across the castle courtyard, turning puddles from yesterday's rain into mirrors that fractured beneath hurried footsteps. Eleanor stood at her chamber window, watching the unusual flurry of activity below. Servants rushed with purpose, guards assembled in formal lines, and villagers streamed through the opened gates in numbers she had never witnessed before. Something momentous approached, something that tightened her chest with equal parts anticipation and dread. 3 days had passed since the council chamber confrontation. 3 days of whispered speculation and wary glances. 3 days during which Eleanor had existed in a strange limbo, neither embraced nor rejected, but suspended between worlds in a position no one quite understood, herself included. The king had withdrawn to his private chambers, emerging only for essential matters of state. Lord Bartley's influence had visibly diminished, though Eleanor harbored no illusions that his ambition had been permanently curtailed. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Princess Matilda entered without waiting for response, her small face alight with barely contained excitement. "They're saying Father will address the kingdom today," she said, dispensing with formal greetings. "From the eastern balcony, the one Mother used to love." Eleanor's heart stumbled. "The eastern balcony?" Matilda nodded, moving to stand beside her at the window. "He's ordered everyone to attend, even the villagers." Anxiety coiled in Eleanor's stomach. Public declarations rarely benefited those in precarious positions. Despite the king's unexpected defense in the council chamber, she knew too well how quickly royal favor could shift. This grand gesture could as easily signal her final humiliation as her vindication. "Has he sent for me?" Eleanor asked, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "Not yet," the princess replied, her hand finding Eleanor's and squeezing with unexpected strength. "But he will." The child's certainty, so at odds with the hard lessons of court politics, touched something deep within Eleanor. This young girl, born to privilege yet schooled in loss, retained a faith in justice that the adults around her had long since abandoned. "Whatever happens," Eleanor said softly, "remember that your kindness has meant everything to me." Matilda looked up, suddenly solemn. "You won't leave us, will you? Even if they try to make you?" Before Eleanor could form a response that balanced truth with compassion, another knock came. Sharp, official. A royal guard stood at attention in the corridor. "His Majesty requests your immediate presence, Your Highness." His eyes focused somewhere above Eleanor's head, as if afraid direct contact might contaminate him. The princess's grip tightened momentarily before she released Eleanor's hand. "See," she whispered, "I told you he would call for you." Eleanor followed the guard through corridors that seemed both familiar and foreign, as if she traversed them in a dream. Servants paused in their tasks to watch her pass, their expressions unreadable. The usual whispers that followed her had been replaced by something more unsettling: silence. The guard led her not to the council chamber or the king's solar, but to a small antechamber adjoining the eastern balcony. The king waited alone, dressed in formal regalia that glittered with gold thread and polished gemstones. The crown upon his head caught the light from narrow windows, casting fractured rainbows against stone walls. "Leave us," he commanded the guard, who bowed and withdrew. Eleanor stood before him, hands clasped to hide their trembling. The king studied her with that same inscrutable intensity she had glimpsed during the feast, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with his expectations. "You wonder why I've called you here," he said finally. "I assume to inform me of my fate," Eleanor replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps at her directness. In a manner of speaking. He moved to the window, looking out at the gathered crowd below. "I have spent 3 days considering what transpired in the council chamber. 3 days pondering what kind of kingdom I wish to leave my daughters." Eleanor remained silent, sensing that any interruption might break whatever fragile understanding had formed between them. "When Sophia died," he continued, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear, "something in me died with her. The ability to see beyond immediate concerns, the wisdom to remember that a king serves his people, not merely rules them." He turned back to face her. "You have reminded me of that forgotten truth, however unintentionally." "I have only spoken as my conscience dictated," Eleanor said carefully. "Yes." The single word carried a weight of recognition. "That is precisely what makes you dangerous to men like Bartley, and valuable to a kingdom that has forgotten how to listen to more than one voice." A servant entered with a small wooden box, presenting it to the king before withdrawing. The king opened it, revealing a slender circlet of silver, simpler than the crown Eleanor normally wore for official functions, yet somehow more substantial. "This belonged to the first queen of our line," he said, lifting it from its velvet nest. "Not the most valuable of the royal jewels, but perhaps the most significant. She was a woman of common birth who rose through her own merit, before such things were forbidden by convention." Eleanor's breath caught as he stepped toward her. "I don't understand." "You will stand beside me today," the king said, "not as a political necessity or a convenient symbol, but as a voice the crown cannot afford to silence." He placed the circlet upon her head, its weight settling with surprising lightness. "A voice that speaks for those who have too long gone unheard." Eleanor struggled to process his words, searching for the trap or manipulation that must surely lie beneath this unexpected elevation. "The nobles will never accept such a role for me." "Some will not," he agreed, his eyes holding hers with unexpected frankness. "Others already reconsider their positions. Power recognizes power, Eleanor, even when it comes in unfamiliar forms." Before she could respond, bells began to toll across the castle grounds, the signal that the royal address would commence. The king moved toward the balcony doors, pausing with his hand upon the latch. "I told you once that my heart died with Sophia," he said, not looking back at her. "That remains true. I offer you no false promises of affection or romantic attachment." The words stung despite their truth, perhaps because of it. Eleanor had never expected love from this arranged union, yet having its absence confirmed, reopened wounds she had thought scarred over. "But I offer you something perhaps more valuable," he continued. "Respect, purpose, the chance to build something that outlasts either of us." He glanced back at her, his expression softened by something almost like regret. "Is that enough?" Eleanor considered the question that would define the remainder of her life. Was purpose enough without love? Could respect fill the hollowness where affection should reside? The answer came not as certainty, but as possibility. Not completion, but beginning. "It must be," she said simply. He nodded once, accepting her answer without pressing for false enthusiasm. Then, with a gesture that invited her forward, he opened the doors to the balcony. Sunlight blinded her momentarily as she stepped into the open air. Below, the courtyard teemed with people, nobles in their finery clustered near the castle walls, villagers and merchants filling the remaining space in a sea of homespun wool and practical leather. A hush fell as they appeared, anticipation tightening the collective breath of hundreds. The king stood tall beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, yet separated by distances no physical proximity could bridge. When he spoke, his voice carried with practiced authority to the furthest corners of the gathering. "People of Westbrook and lands beyond," he began, "I stand before you today at a moment of transformation for our kingdom." Eleanor felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, calculating, curious, hopeful, hostile, a maelstrom of expectations she could never fully satisfy. For generations, the crown has heard primarily one voice, that of nobility and tradition. The king's words caused a ripple of unease among the finely dressed courtiers below. Today, I declare that this narrowness of vision ends. He turned slightly toward Eleanor, though his gaze remained on the crowd. I present to you your queen, not as my heart's companion, for that was lost and cannot be replaced, but as the voice of the people that shall never again be silenced in this kingdom. The declaration fell upon the crowd like a stone into still water, shock rippling outward in visible waves. Eleanor herself stood frozen, the implication of his words washing over her with dizzying force. Not a love match. That dream had died on the altar with his whispered confession, but something entirely unexpected. Recognition, legitimacy, power of a kind no peasant-born woman had wielded in living memory. The crown must remember who it serves, the king continued. Not merely those within castle walls, but every soul who lives beneath its protection. Her Majesty will ensure that this truth is never again forgotten. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor caught sight of Lord Bartley's face, contorted with barely suppressed fury. Beside him, other nobles displayed varying degrees of shock, calculation, and in a few surprising cases, thoughtful consideration. Among the common folk, confusion gradually gave way to cautious hope as the king's meaning penetrated. When the king finished speaking, a strange silence held for several heartbeats. Then, from the back of the crowd, a single voice called out, "Long live the people's queen!" The cry was taken up by others, tentatively at first, then with growing conviction. Not universal, not unanimous, but enough to fill the courtyard with sound that rose toward the balcony like a physical force. Eleanor stood straight beneath its weight, the silver circlet cool against her brow. The emptiness within her, that space where love should have resided, remained. Yet something else had begun to fill the surrounding chambers of her heart. Not happiness, perhaps, but purpose. Not completion, but possibility. As they withdrew from the balcony, the princesses waited in the antechamber, their small faces alight with complicated emotion. Rosalind rushed forward first, wrapping her arms around Eleanor's waist with unrestrained affection. Matilda followed more sedately, her embrace tempered by the dignity of her station yet no less genuine. The king watched this tableau with an expression Eleanor could not quite decipher. Pain mingled with acceptance, regret with resolution. He would never love her as he had loved his first queen. That door had closed on the day of their wedding, sealed with words that could not be unsaid. My heart died with the mother of my daughters. But within that painful truth lay another, unexpected and powerful in its own right. Hearts that cannot love may still respect. Lives that cannot share passion may still share purpose. The absence of romantic love need not mean the absence of all connection. As Eleanor embraced the children who had somehow become hers in all but blood, she recognized the path that stretched before her. Not the fairy tale she might once have dreamed of, with its promise of adoration and happily ever after, but something rarer and perhaps more valuable, the chance to build meaning from rejection, strength from adversity, hope from despair. The emptiness within her would remain, a hollow space that ached in quiet moments. But around it, like new growth after forest fire, something sturdy had begun to take root. A sense of self not defined by another's love, but by her own capacity to transform limitation into possibility. Not the ending she had once imagined, but perhaps the beginning she needed. Not a heart fulfilled, but a life with purpose. In the complex geometry of human connection, perhaps that was, if not everything, at least enough to build upon. Sometimes life offers us not what we dream of, but what we need to become who we're meant to be. Eleanor's journey from scorned peasant bride to respected queen reminds us that dignity can bloom even in the harshest conditions. When faced with rejection, she found purpose. When denied love, she discovered strength. Would you have had the courage to tear that document? To speak truth to power? To accept a life without romantic love but filled with meaningful purpose? We often measure happiness by the love we receive, but perhaps the true measure lies in what we build from whatever foundation we're given. Eleanor's story asks us, is it better to be adored but powerless, or respected but unloved? Can we find fulfillment and purpose when our hearts remain empty? These questions echo long after the castle fades from view, challenging us to examine our own definitions of success and happiness. If this story touched your heart or sparked reflection, remember that stories like these survive only when shared. Follow for more tales that explore the complicated truths of human experience, where happy endings aren't always what we expect them to be, but sometimes they're exactly what we need. Like, share, and let us know in the comments. What would you choose if faced with Eleanor's impossible choice? A crown without love or no crown at all?